Here we have chapter 4. Just about everybody had fallen asleep because of Merlin's boring story, which the author found, quite amusing because, he had never heard it before. And then the guy, the Sir Dinadan the humorist, woke up first, decided, hey, tie some mugs and bits of metal to the dog's tail and get the dog running. So the dog started running, makes a big clatter. The other dogs hear the clatter and start chasing after that dog. And that dog, because it's being chased, starts running. So this whole mess is just running big circles around the room, making noise. And then Sir Dinadan starts telling old jokes. Now, the kid, Clarence, whatever his proper name is, the scoffer, doesn't like the jokes, but he doesn't like anything. These may, in fact, have been new jokes 1,300 years ago, but maybe not. There are a lot of jokes which are running around, which are just old jokes. And so perhaps these were actually old jokes even then. And the narrator says, oh, yes, petrified is good because, means it's old, something along those lines, and the kid doesn't get petrified. Well, he knows what petrified means. Petrified is turned into rock, but it wasn't considered at that time, or according to the narrator, it wasn't considered in the 1300s or 1300 years before, so the 500s, that things turned into rock over time. They knew about fossils. The ancient Greeks knew about fossils. They'd find these bits of plant. They'd see these things that look like flowers embedded in shale or mudstone or the sedimentary rocks where a flower fell over and layers of silt landed on top of it. And as the layers of silt hardened into rock over the eons and were pressed down, the flower went away, it dissolved, it rotted, but the shape of the flower remained. So there are places where you can find shale, slate, mudstone. These are the ones where you typically find it. Sandstone tends to be a little bit too coarse. You sometimes find it inside of sandstone. Limestone tends to be too fine and is made by a slightly different process, so you don't find as much in that. But shale, slate, there are places where you can just go and you find it, and you hit it with a hammer, or you just kind of bash it, and it pulls apart into layers. And every layer is maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years of rock that's slowly built up. So you have these layers and layers and layers of rock. And if you had a bit of flour that got covered by silt, and then another layer of silt, and it slowly builds up on top of it, and if the flour stays there long enough so that the silt takes the impression before it rots away to nothing, then you can have a fossil. And so you can go and find the rocks and you split it. And there's some rocks actually nearby my house that are just like this. And the thing is, I've never found fossils in them. They're probably the wrong age. I haven't checked what the age of the rocks at that particular layer are. They might be the wrong age that you don't find fossils at that layer. It could be too old, could be too new. It could just be that there was nothing growing around when that was. But anyway, there's these rocks that just tap it and they split and they fall apart. And they tend to split on the fossils because the included fossils are a weak point. So if you have a fossil and you have the rock and you tap it, it splits. That's where you typically find the fossil. So here he is. He is going to teach these people geology just in order to get the joke. And this is the type of rock that I was talking about. Nice and flat. It splits into layers. And this is kind of a special rock because if you can see, there's flowers there. Now that is not a fossil. That is a carving that I did for your Lolli. I made it for her as a Christmas present. I found these rocks, and they're pretty rocks. And as I said, I've split dozens and dozens of them looking for fossils. Never found any. But I was like, this would be really great to carve on. And I was like, I want to try carving rocks sometime. So I got out the Dremel and I carved it, and it's like, this is pretty. I should give it to Lolli for Christmas present. So I gave it to her for a Christmas present. She's like, "Where did you find the fossil?" It's like, it's not a fossil. It's art. I drew it. I made it. She's like, "Wow." So I was happy that she loved it. She'd love it if it was ugly because I worked hard at it and I tried and it's almost pretty. But she'd love it because of the effort that I put into it. But she she thought it was pretty and thought it was a fossil, which is just like a win for me. But so that's the type of rock, and as I said, the ancients knew about fossils. So they didn't quite understand the process. They were like, "Hey, this is a fish that's in a rock," or "This is bones of an animal which are in a rock." And there was some discussion as to whether they were demons that were cast down from heaven and embedded in rock, or there were all sorts of weird theories about what caused them. But that was fossils, and here he is. He's going to teach them geology in order for them to get the joke, which is a lot of work in order for them to get a joke. But it's a joke, and it'll be a new joke, so that's kind of cool. And one of the things that they were like is, look at his clothes. So here you have somebody with pants. Now, this was before zippers, so he didn't have a zipper, and zippers would have just been magic to them. I mean, zippers in a lot of ways are magic, and so it wouldn't have zippers, it wouldn't have Velcro. They didn't have buttons then. Buttons are a relatively new invention. Belts are a relatively new invention. Belt loops. Belt loops were probably only 50 or 80 years old at the time he went back into from the time he went into the past. So, I mean, they wouldn't have seen a belt. They wouldn't have seen belt loops. Well, they would have seen belts because, you tie a rope around your waist and that's a belt. But they would have seen belt loops. Pockets were a wild thing back then. Because typically what they had purses. Or they would have little bags that they would hang off of the rope that they tied around their waist for a belt. So the whole idea of a pocket in pants was just like insane. Plus the fabric. So if you're to take a look at the old time fabric, they could only make thread so thin, because the thinner the thread, the far more work it is. So you would have kings who would have stuff that is relatively coarse to what we have today. So, I mean, if you had a t-shirt, that was just like the stuff that goes into making a t-shirt today is far finer than what kings would have been wearing in the 500s. So here you have these clothes. It's just like, this is the normal stuff. Plus, they're not bright colors. And I mean, once they figured out dyes were everywhere. The ancient Greek statues, bright colors. They've done, they did archaeological work and they studied it really close and they found little chips of paint. And the ancient Greek statues that we all think of as white marble were actually brightly colored. I mean, bright oranges and reds and greens. Blue was difficult, but reds and greens and oranges, and so all of these bright colors. And so colors were a big thing. And so here you have this guy who was in his work clothes, which are relatively drab. So, as I said, the kings were set off by their bright colors. If you're to read in the Bible, the priests, the ancient priests, 1,000 years BC, when they were coming out of Egypt and God said, okay, this is the way the priests are going to dress. All of the descriptions there, it's red and scarlet and blue and purple. So those were bright colors, and bright colors were reserved for the royalty. And there were places where the king's law was only the king can wear purple. Doesn't matter who you are, how much money you have, you are not allowed to wear purple. Only the king can wear purple. So here you have this guy in khakis and a work shirt, maybe with belt loops, probably with pockets. And these clothes are of a finer material than anything they've ever seen. They've never seen anything that are made that well. But at the same time, they're not used to seeing colors that drab because everyone would be dyeing things any color they have. And it's like, okay, I could make this red dye out of these plants, and they would dye things red, or dye things green, or dye things yellow. And, but here you have this in beige, brown, probably not even dyed indigo, blue jeans. But here you have this just very basic drab colors, but a very fine workmanship, and this just blew their mind. Plus, pants weren't really a thing, and here he had pants, and he had shoes that were probably of a manufacturer that they were like beyond. Well, the shoes haven't evolved that much, so the shoes would probably be recognizable to them. But the shirt and the pants, and things that buttoned up, they didn't have buttons. So, they had some things that tied together, but buttons were a relatively recent invention at this time. Weren't invented then. I was astonished hanging out with people from the Ren Fair many, many years ago about how new buttons were and how new spindles were and things like that. It's like, you mean they didn't? It's surprising how new some of these things are. But so his clothes were just outrageous to them. And so they took them off. And plus it didn't help that Sir Kay said, oh, his clothes were magical. And they protected him. And I prayed and they took the magic away. Because everybody believes the stories that everyone else is telling. So Sir Kay, I killed 13 knights. No. He chased a guy up a tree. And he climbed the tree. He didn't jump up a huge 200 cubit tree. So a cubit is from here to here. Typically regarded as about 1.5 feet. It depends on the person, but typically about 18 inches, 1.5 feet. 2 cubits, 300-foot tree. There are not many 300-foot trees. Giant redwoods get that big. I think that's about at the limit an oak can reach. But there are not many 300-foot trees. So, says, oh yeah, 300-foot tree. One jump. Everyone's telling these outlandish stories. Now, he's scheduled to be executed on the 21st at noon. Why does that date sound familiar?